Okay, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar. My name is Regan Downey, and I'm the Director of Education at the Wolf Conservation Center. I'm also joined by Dr. Joey Hinton, the Wolf Conservation Center's Senior Research Scientist. The Wolf Conservation Center works to protect and preserve wolf populations through science-based education programming, advocacy, research, and active recovery. We work to recover endangered wolf populations through participation in federal recovery programs for critically endangered red wolves and Mexican gray wolves. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping tips. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question and answer box in the control panel, and we'll answer as many as we can. Also, a recorded version of this webinar will be available on the WCC's website within the next few days. Today, we are generously joined by Dr. Michelle Lute, the Co-Executive Director of Wildlife for All. Michelle is a conservation scientist and advocate with nearly 20 years' experience in biodiversity conservation on public and private lands around the globe. Michelle holds a PhD in wildlife management from Michigan State University, a master's degree in animal behavior and ecology from the University of Notre Dame, and a bachelor's degree in geography and environmental science from Valparaiso University. She started her environmental career in the National Park Service, worked for large and small nonprofits, state government, and held research positions at universities across the U.S. Dr. Lute has authored over 30 publications in ecology and social sciences to develop evidence-based approaches to human-wildlife coexistence. And we are so excited to have her here tonight. Take it away, Dr. Lute.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone at the Wolf Conservation Center for inviting me to present today. And thanks to you all for joining. I want to jump right in because we have a lot to cover and I want to leave time to discuss with you all at the end of the Q&A session. And first, I want to start with a story. It's a tragic story that foreshadowed the cruel crime that we're here to talk about today. The author, Cormac McCarthy, envisioned the depravity of hateful men towards wolves in a scene from his book, The Crossing, where a boy captures a pregnant wolf in hopes of releasing her across the Mexican border, where he believes she will be safer. In the process, though, tragically, she gets captured by other men and tortured in round after round of dogfighting until the boy must force himself to do the only merciful thing that he can do and kill her to stop the madness. It's the most brutal piece of writing I've ever read, and I want to share two excerpts with you today. He talked to her a long time, and as the boy tending the wolf could not understand what it was he said what was in his heart. He made promises that he swore to keep in the making, that he would take her to the mountains, where she would find others of her kind. She watched him with her yellow eyes, and in them was no despair, but only the same reckonless deep of loneliness that cored the world to its heart. After he ends her life, the passage continues. He squatted over the wolf and touched her fur. He touched the cold and perfect teeth. The eye turned to the fire, gave back no light, and he closed it with his thumb. And he sat by her and put his hand upon her bloodied forehead and closed his own eyes, that he could see her running in the mountains, running in the starlight where the grass was wet, and the sun's coming up as yet had not undone the rich matrix of creatures past in the night before her. Deer and hare and dove and groundfowl, all richly empaneled on the air for her delight, all nations of the possible world ordained by God, of which she was one among and not separate from, where she ran the cries of coyotes clapped shut, as if a door had closed upon them, and all was fear and marvel. He took up her stiff head out of the leaves and held it, or he reached to hold what cannot be held, what already ran among the mountains, at once terrible and of great beauty, like flowers that feed on flesh. Now, that may be the work of fiction, but the thing about McCarthy is that he lays bare the brutality of reality. In that sense, what he writes is nonfiction, only the superficial details are different. Briefly, to summarize what most of you likely already know, but to make sure anyone listening understands the situation. A Wyoming resident on a snowmobile chased down and ran over a yearling wolf, then bound the dying animal's mouth, dragged her to his house, paraded his tortured trophy through a local bar, and after he was finished with his deranged display, dispatched the pup behind the bar. Videos and photos were eventually leaked to the press and social media. The world responded in outrage, not knowing that such atrocities and crimes occur frequently. In the Northern Rocky states, it is legal to intentionally run down and then over predators with vehicles. 6 years ago, Todd Wilkinson wrote on an investigative report about similar lethal incidents that involved Wyoming residents running over coyotes with snowmobiles, a common winter activity according to local game wardens. Just like the recent torture case, participants filmed the atrocities and posted videos on social media. As Wilkinson explains, quote, despite the recent characterizations made by Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon and Brian Nesvik, director of the Wyoming Fish and Game Department, that the 2024 Roberts incident was a rare singular one-off event, these videos prove otherwise. Combined with banter on hunting chat sites and interviews I did with Sublette County residents who say chasing down wolves and coyotes with snowmobiles was a well-known form of winter entertainment, those arguments do not hold up, end quote. Partly in response to the raised awareness from those previous egregious videos, Wyoming legislator Mike Yin introduced a bill in 2019 that would have outlawed motorized pursuit and killing of wolves and coyotes and prevented this recent torture case. But the 2019 legislation never got a hearing, thanks to opposition from livestock and hunting lobbyists. Similarly, in Montana, then State Senator Mike Phillips, a Democrat, lifelong hunter, and renowned wildlife biologist, made several attempts to get bills passed to outlaw these controversial practices, but he too, quote, ran into a brick wall of opposition, end quote. That's from the good old boy cowboys in Montana Senate. I can't emphasize enough, this isn't an isolated case. It's not unique to Wyoming, or the Northern Rockies, or to wolves or coyotes. Across the country, humans take the lives of cougars, foxes, bobcats, and other unprotected animals without restraint or regulation. This occurs because of an entrenched, archaic system of government that has existed since the 1930s or earlier, and which serves to protect a minority interest at the expense of democracy, science, and the sanctity of life. I'm going to elaborate on this point as it relates to the crime committed by the Wyoming resident in February. To start, I'm going to show the next photo, which is disturbing, and that will be the last of the sad or graphic photos that I share in this presentation. I choose to show this image because it indeed depicts the state of wildlife management, not only in Wyoming, but across the country. The included quote is from the Wyoming Game and Fish's statement of denial in response to the Wyoming crime. What happened is certainly not the gold standard in wildlife management, but it is generally the standard. Almost nowhere in the US are wild animals allowed to go about their lives in freedom from persecution or exploitation. The safest animals are those that never step outside the proverbial zoos of our national parks, where their wild lives are justified by the dollars brought by tourism and wildlife watching. Now, I've gotten flack for equating wildlife management with images such as this one, or of a killing contest participant standing with the 50 coyotes he killed in a single weekend. Well-meaning agency folks take issue with this and want to point out all the great things that state wildlife agencies have done. They point out how great deer and elk and turkey are doing. We did that, thank a hunter. Well, for every success story, there are untold tragedies that don't make the news. Each of the harangued, tortured, and murdered wolves in the photographic evidence that we do have represent thousands of crimes against nature. Trophy hunting, trapping, snaring, poisoning, burning pups alive in their dens, wildlife killing contests, using lead bullets that poison animals throughout the food chain, destroying habitat, draining wetlands, no bag limits for coyotes, bobcats, foxes, ravens, rabbits, so-called misting of prairie dogs, killing grizzly bears and cougars, ostensibly to protect livestock, even though preventing conflict is the most effective method. All of these crimes are manifestations of a systemic problem and evidence that something is deeply, deeply rotten in the states of Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and beyond. This will continue until we radically reform the system of wildlife governance in America. Current wildlife governance protects the status quo oppressive management system instead of wild animals and biodiverse ecosystems. It does so by privileging traditional consumptive users over diverse American publics and modern best available science. The first problem with the system is that people don't realize it exists or how it operates. When they think of conservation, they likely think of the Endangered Species Act. But one has to look no further than gray wolves' swings in ESA listing status to realize that important federal law fails to save anyone except those lucky few currently on the list. Not those waiting to be listed, not those too politically complex to get listed, not those listed under the 10J experimental non-essential designation, not the many once abundant and now steeply declining species that are losing habitat, unable to quickly adapt enough to climate change or the cascading issues related to mass extinction. So what is governance? One way of looking at it is that it is the formal expression embodied in laws and regulation of a society's relationship with the wild animals we share the earth with and wild nature more broadly. Wildlife policies are typically made by powerful defenders of the status quo and reflect their decisions about which species are important and deserving of protection and which are of no consequence to decision makers, which supposedly need to be managed by humans and which can be left to their own devices. Because our current wildlife governance structures are dominated by white settler mentalities that have not evolved much, if at all, from a manifest destiny mindset, we see liberalized lethality for wolves and other vulnerable wildlife who are not valued or even despised by the powerful. Thus, a lack of protective regulations and a focus on lethal management signals to an extreme minority of humans who hate carnivores that cruelty and rampant killing are tolerated and accepted norms. The crime in Wyoming was not an isolated incident. It is the inevitable result of a system that fails to value and protect life and ignores diverse voices. A little bit more about state governance systems. Every state is a little different, but in general, the structure of wildlife governance is the same in all states. The legislature passes laws that provide the rationale, scope, and legal authority for wildlife management. Every state has a wildlife agency that is responsible for implementing and enforcing wildlife policies, either as a standalone agency or part of a larger department. And in most states, a volunteer wildlife commission or board is appointed by the governor with the consent of the state senate to establish policies or advise the state wildlife agency. Historically, the system has been funded by two main sources: the sale of hunting and fishing licenses, and federal grants tied to the sale of guns, ammunition, gasoline for motorboats, and other items. In many states, the State Wildlife Agency receives no general funding from the legislature, which limits the agency's transparency and accountability to the general public. Furthermore, agency policy and consideration for urgent non-human interests is severely hampered by their statutory mission, vision, and objectives, and these all outright dismiss the interests and claims of animals. The problems with this system are also the same in every state, more or less. It is a system that was developed in large part by hunters like Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, primarily for the benefit of hunters. Decision-making continues to be dominated by hunters, anglers, and trappers, who constitute a shrinking minority of the public. It prioritizes the production of harvestable surpluses of a handful of game and sport fish species that are of interest to license buyers. Think deer, turkey, and trout. The majority of native wildlife tend to receive far less conservation attention. In the case of carnivores, they are even persecuted, as the world now knows all too well. The system is out of step with modern science, norms of democratic governance, changing public values, and public trust principles, and I'll discuss those a little bit more later. The old model is no longer sufficient to meet the challenges of wildlife conservation today. The system itself is a barrier to effectively addressing the twin crises of mass extinction and climate change, and the intrinsic value of all life. The systemic problems are perpetuated by an insidious and misleading narrative, namely with one that claims things like hunting is conservation, which means management to produce harvestable surpluses of wild animals. Only game species are of value to humans because we use them. Carnivores are competitors for game, and they don't positively impact ecosystems. Livestock are protected by killing carnivores. This is the orthodoxy that prevails in state management, and it also includes other ill-informed notions like carnivores and bears ought to be killed and dogs can be exploited in the slaughter. Wild animals are simply resources, Animal rights are considered a threat to the status quo as well as American values and traditions, and that only populations and species matter. Individual animals or their social groups don't matter in this orthodoxy. Despite the fact that a growing biological body of evidence is eroding this claim as well, showing that the loss of even one individual in a pack can undermine pack persistence and reproduction. Essentially, our system was designed by Teddy Roosevelt types and still harbors his backward and uninformed ideas of the wild world, as embodied in his opinion of wolves as the beast of waste and desolation. In modern vernacular, that is to say, the only good wolf is a dead wolf. What state agencies and hunters fail to point out is that their model of management allows many lives to slip through the cracks. Hence the apocalyptic situation facing whole taxonomic groups of animals, from corals to insects to birds and beyond. Most hunters are not advocating for beaver recovery to increase resilience of systems against catastrophic wildfire. They are certainly not advocating to share wild spaces and their preferred game species with other carnivores. The result is not only willful negligence of species in need of conservation, but also a system that encourages illegal activity. A growing body of science is mounting evidence that a lack of state and federal protections for species like wolves signals to an emboldened group of trophy hunters that these animals are not valued and killing them illegally will not be punished. Where hunting has been liberalized, such as in the Northern Rockies, where laws allow wolves and coyotes to be run over by snowmobiles, shot from aircraft, trapped, snared, and hunted with no regard, all incentivized with bounties, scientists have found increased rates of collared wolves disappearing. This measurement is the best way to track cryptic poaching, but illegal hunting activity of all sorts occurs in the wild places that wolves roam and is difficult to track. That is, until someone parades their criminal activity in the local tavern. Make no mistake about what the Wyoming crime tells us about the state of not only wildlife management, but of our country. It is the flagrant manifestation of a systemic problem, a colonist culture who has always believed their members can dominate whoever they want, be they wild lands and lives or humans. Within days of this wolf torture, Cowboy State Daily, is a local paper in Wyoming, had reported that Wyoming rates of murdered missing Indigenous peoples are among the highest in the U.S. Wyoming is, of course, tragically known for the murder of Matthew Shepard, one of the worst hate crimes in contemporary American history. This isn't a coincidence. A large body of evidence already links animal cruelty to violence to humans, from domestic abuse to school massacres. As Nobel Peace Prize recipient Dr. Albert Schweitzer explained, quote, "The link between human and animal violence is so predictable that I have come to look at hunting, trapping, and fishing as the first offensive fronts for creating an indifference to suffering. For far too long, people have been reluctant to discuss the empirically established link for fear of accusations of racism, of equating human and other than human life. A woman is not a wolf. School children need their own special protections in America, but all are vulnerable to the emboldened, caustic, far-right, white male-dominated violence that is taking life across our country. They need us to stand up now and fight for all of them." Now, I've mentioned that this system is undemocratic and ignores the voices of diverse people who value wildlife alive and thriving. Let's dig into that a little bit more before we discuss solutions. Not only is wildlife management not democratic, it is a bastion of anti-democracy. It has been captured by a narrow group of users, namely hunters, anglers, and trappers, who do not represent the broad public interest in wildlife. These are the people who disproportionately are represented on wildlife commissions and among agency staff, and who play a disproportionate role in shaping wildlife policy. According to our analysis of online bios from 2020, hunters make up about 4% of the American public, but occupy over 70% of all state wildlife commission seats. I've included on this slide photos of the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission, as well as a number of key sponsors and other legislators supporting Representative Boevert's wolf delisting bill and other anti-wildlife bills. Notice anything? Remember that photo I included earlier of Nixon signing the ESA when I was defining coexistence? Not a whole lot has changed from that time, and the decision makers selling wildlife to the highest bidder and calling for all-out slaughter of wolves and other carnivores are still old, white, tyrannical, gun-toting, wolf pelt-wearing cowboys and girls and strongman types. These are the demographics served by this system. This is data from 2022 on hunter demographics. Just like commissions and boards, this group is dominated by older white men. Despite state agencies tokenizing efforts to make their hunting programs appealing to younger audiences, to women and BIPOC communities, the demographic being catered to in state policy matches the makeup of board members, white men of a certain ilk. What sort of ilk, do you ask? The traditional ilk. According to a national survey, arguably the most comprehensive to date on this issue, traditionalists are sometimes referred to as utilitarians and characterized by a view of human mastery over wildlife and a prioritization of human well-being over wildlife. Traditionalists are basically synonymous with hunters and support the exploitation of animals for human uses. While traditionalists are a minority across the US, they account for almost half of Wyoming respondents to this survey. The national picture is depicted in this chart from America's Wildlife Values Report, where the arrows denote that the numbers of mutualists are increasing while traditionalists are declining. More Americans are mutualists, believing that humans and wildlife are meant to live in harmony, and thus that wildlife deserve rights similar to the rights of humans. Most Americans also recognize the intrinsic value of wildlife, meaning that an entity has the right to exist beyond their use to anyone else. Americans are much more interested in wildlife viewing opportunities, which can be enjoyed by many more people than hunting. One person takes a life and few others benefit in that case. Because wildlife agencies are captured by this special interest group, policy doesn't match scientific evidence for the best practices or the values and needs of broader publics. Most Americans do not support trophy hunting, which is basically all hunting of predators and bears, who are omnivores, because few people hunt these species for food or other subsistence. Yet current policies don't reflect these values, nor the science increasingly making clear that human-caused mortality disrupts the important social fabric of wild animal lives and can actually serve to increase human-wildlife conflict. One set of policies completely out of line with science are those delineating the predator zone in Wyoming, where wolves are eradicated by any means in 85% of the state, despite their historic range encompassing all of Wyoming lands. According to a very recently released report from the state, there are 352 wolves statewide, with about half in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department claims that this is a testament to their ability to manage the species. But what they don't tell you is that the state could be home to so many more wolves if people weren't legally and illegally killing them. What's more, science tells us that wolves bring outsized benefits across ecosystems where they are allowed to function at ecologically effective populations. They change prey behavior such that ungulates hang out less along roads, thereby reducing collisions with vehicles and saving both money and human lives. They drastically reduce chronic wasting disease, which is spreading across the country at alarming rates. The list of benefits goes on and on. Furthermore, the liberalized killing of wolves doesn't even fit within traditional priorities of capitalism. Wolves have been a significant driver of tourism revenue in the states of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, thanks to the popularity of wolf watching and other wildlife viewing activities. Here's a summary of some of the economic impacts from wolf-related tourism in these states. In Montana, in 2019, it was estimated that wolf watching generated over $27 million in tourism spending. A University of Montana study found that visitors traveling specifically to see wolves spent around $35 million annually in recent years. In Wyoming, a 2008 study found that the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park boosted annual visitor spending in the state by around $35.5 million. More recent data indicates wolf watching creates over 300 jobs and $25 million in annual expenditures related to Yellowstone. In Idaho, specific figures on wolf-related tourism spending are less publicized, but given the presence of wolves in places like Sawtooth National Recreation Area, it's estimated wolf watching contributes millions in tourism revenue. The overall wildlife watching industry in Idaho generates over $500 million in expenditures annually. The presence and ability to view wolves in their natural habitats has become a major ecotourism draw for these northern Rocky states, generating well over $1 million in visitor spending each year across the region, excuse me. This highlights the economic incentive to maintain and promote wolf populations for communities surrounding national parks and wilderness areas, and anywhere else that we allow wolves to thrive. In essence, wolves and Yellowstone's other iconic wildlife are one of the biggest economic engines for tourism across that tri-state area. The park's reputation as an iconic U.S. outdoor destination makes it a critical asset supporting thousands of jobs and billions in economic activity annually for these rural state economies. Despite the fact that our representatives ignore the many benefits of wildlife alive, there are many methods for modernizing and democratizing wildlife policy and conservation efforts. Some best practices include prioritizing animal and social justice, what we might call multi-species justice. Multi-species justice includes promoting pluralist ethical dialogue by emphasizing intersectionality against all oppressions, be they racist, classist, xenophobic, gender-biased, heterosexist, ableist, or anthropocentric. The National Wolf Recovery Plan is a place for building these arguments and considerations into public discourse, and we can perhaps discuss this more in the Q&A if people are interested. We can also prioritize the needs and inclusion of diverse and disenfranchised communities in decision processes and advocate for conservation practices to respect individual well-being, protect biodiversity, and ecosystem health. This is how to create more just and equitable governance. This doesn't mean that hunters don't get a say in wildlife policymaking, but that they equitably share space at the decision-making table, which is not occurring right now. Reform advocates are getting a lot of pushback from defenders of the status quo, who are unfortunately backed by who stand to gain from supporting hunters as avid gun buyers. On the NRA's website, they say, quote, "The fight against gun control in general is inseparable from the fight for the rights of hunters," end quote. So we're seeing hunting organizations even fight common sense gun control legislation. We need to be prepared for a lot of dark money funding our opponents at every stage of our fight for justice. That is why our fight for justice for the young Wyoming wolf and for justice for all must be sustained, enduring, nimble grassroots movement that does not fizzle out and that includes a level of strategy and cooperation among wildlife advocates that we have not seen in decades. We will never have the funding that our opponents do, but we must speak truth to power with integrity, accuracy, transparency, and consistency that builds a large, powerful community of people power. We must not let our opponents define the terms of the fight. Traditionally, we wildlife advocates have tried to counter our opponents' narratives with myth-busting that repeats their talking points. But social studies have seen that what people remember from such myth-busting is the myth and not the facts. And while they are important and we should not stray from them, the facts aren't going to be the way we win this war. A common saying in politics is that if you're explaining, you're losing. We're agitating for radical change that speaks to people's hearts, because in their hearts, Americans know that these crimes against nature are wrong. We need to reach all sorts of diverse folks, the people that care about wildlife, and know about maybe a little bit about climate change and maybe about mass extinction, but that don't realize state decision-making allows such egregious practices as running wild wolves and coyotes over with snowmobiles. An effective grassroots movement, leveraging passionate local activists, powerful narratives, strategic lobbying, and diverse coalitions, is often the catalyst to overcoming political inertia and achieving legislative change. To reach those folks, the key elements for building an effective grassroots movement to drive policy change include: 1, a clear and compelling message. We need to develop a simple, easy to understand message that clearly articulates a problem and proposed solution. This unifying message should resonate emotionally and morally. Diverse coalition building. It will be important to identify and mobilize a broad coalition of citizens from different backgrounds, community groups, pro-wildlife businesses, social justice nonprofits, religious institutions. A diverse and united front lends credibility. Leadership development. cultivate passionate leaders at the local level who can organize and rally their communities, provide activist toolkits and other training and skills like public speaking, media relations, lobbying, and campaigning. Public awareness. To reach beyond our typical choir and generate a groundswell of support, we can utilize creative tactics and events to raise public awareness through earned media, rallies, forums, petitions, even guerrilla marketing, which is a set of unconventional low-cost marketing tactics that leverage creativity and imagination to generate buzz and awareness in an innovative way. Examples include pop-up performances and interactive installations in public spaces. The key is that they're low budget and high impact when done right. Lobbying and advocacy. Persistent grassroots lobbying is key. Building relationships with representatives through meetings, calls, emails, and office visits. Coordination at all levels of government, from local to federal, will help scale up impact. We'll need to activate the base by turning supporters out for public hearings, town halls, and getting them to directly contact elected officials through calls and emails. Harnessing personal stories. Highlight real people's experiences and narratives related to the issue will be super important. We have to humanize the cause, explain the links between violence to humans and animals, and make it tangible for policymakers. Data and research is also so important. Ground the movement's narrative in solid data, facts, expert research, and economic impacts to strengthen credibility with policymakers. Some research needs include which states allow motorized pursuit and killing, which states have rights to hunt and fish amendments or initiatives ongoing, as well as accurate numbers of agricultural profits, say compared to other wildlife watching and related tourism, for instance. We have lots of opportunities for research internships and volunteer projects, so reach out to us, and I'll talk more about that at the end. Finally, we need perseverance. Policy change often takes many, many years. Sustain momentum through short-term goals and small victories to maintain morale and grow steadily towards our big goals. Our short-term goals might include working with state legislatures to ban the use of snowmobiles as killing machines, eliminating or drastically changing the predator zone in Wyoming, and changing wolf status, for instance, from species in need of management to fur bearers in Montana. Simply changing status won't protect them from hunting and trapping, and that is woefully inadequate. But it might be a necessary or complementary step to strengthen cruelty laws so that wolves are protected just as domestic animals are, either state by state or at the federal level, or perhaps at both. Closing loopholes that create categorical exclusions for predators in hunting and federal law that was passed in 2019, referred to as Protecting Animals from Cruelty and Torture Act, that might be another consideration to explore. Of course, many groups are arguing for emergency relisting of wolves on the Endangered Species Act. That is certainly another avenue to consider, but history has shown us that we cannot rely on the ESA in the long run. Wolves and other species that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service can claim are minimally recovered will be delisted, and without better state protections in place, we will find ourselves back to square one, dealing with the morally indefensible and scientifically unjustified policies that states always enact. In order to prevent this so-called predator pendulum of swings from protection to slaughter, we must reform state management to be more just, democratic, and focused on actually conserving, not killing wild nature. This is the mission of Wildlife for All. In doing so, we can create an equitable society and a safe and healthy planet for all. So how do we get there? Well, ideally, in a democracy, wildlife policy would reflect our collective attitudes and sense of responsibilities towards the natural world. Policy should be developed through a process in which everyone's voice is heard, in which all species are valued, and science-informed decisions are made after careful consideration is given to the broad public interest in wildlife, including future generations. To get to that ideal, we must educate ourselves, collaborate, and get organized. One advantage of working towards state-level reform is that grassroots organizing can work well at that scale, and progress can be made regardless of who is president. Our commissioners are accessible, at least more so than, say, many of our U.S. senators. You can be a constant presence at commission meetings. Modernizing and democratizing process includes establishing new sources of funding for wildlife that are not tied to license sales or the sales of guns and ammunition. abolishing wildlife commissions or reforming them to be more diverse and representative of the broader public. This includes persuading governors to appoint non-hunters and scientists to commissions and boards. Litigating or finding other ways to enforce public trust duties of wildlife policymakers, and revising statutes, statutory mandates, and authorities to align with public trust principles, modern science, and public values. I have yet to define public trust, so I want to take a moment to do that now. This is a legal doctrine that has its origins in English common law and has been upheld by U.S. courts over the years. As applied to wildlife, it means that wild animals don't belong to anyone. All wild species are part of a public trust, not just those species of interest to consumptive users. Everyone benefits from wildlife and healthy ecosystems, so we are all beneficiaries of the trust. The government is the trustee. In the case of wildlife, this includes state legislatures and state wildlife commissions or boards. Trustees have a duty to manage the trust for all beneficiaries, including those yet to be born, as well as wild animals themselves. Responsible trust management requires that trustees make an effort to understand, consider, and balance the full range of public views on wildlife. This demands democratic governance. Now, I realize a lot of this might seem like a pipe dream to accomplish in states like Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. But let's not forget, Montana had a Democratic governor not that long ago, and a crime such as the one that occurred in Daniel, Wyoming, shows that people of all political affiliations and backgrounds condemn animal cruelty. We may want to blame Republicans because they provide many horrible examples, including Boebert, Kristi Noem, Gianforte, to name a few. But don't forget, Democratic Senator John Tester is ultimately to blame for Northern Rocky wolves being delisted the last and final time. So this movement will need to include diverse viewpoints and backgrounds. We don't have to agree on all issues to collaborate with Republicans or hunters or ranchers who agree that the sanctity of all life deserves protection. We can and should join forces with diverse social justice advocates to stand up for all lives. And collectively, we can hold leaders and legislators accountable. And as Frederick Douglass, the renowned speaker and abolitionist, explained, power concedes nothing without a demand. The fact that the world knows about this terrible torture and killing of a yearling wolf isn't enough. We need to tell the world that this wasn't an isolated incident, that this is an all too common result of a system designed to protect white settler cowboy culture while oppressing the rest of us, diverse Americans, and the wild nature that we are standing up for. In this fight, you will get called names. You will be accused of being overly emotional and not understanding the reality on the ground. Don't give that credence. Listen to your opponents and be respectful. But that doesn't mean we concede a damn thing in our demands for democratic, evidence-based process to set ethical wildlife policies. You will hear people invoke the logical fallacy of the slippery slope, that we're trying to take away rural freedoms, property, and gun rights. Do not let that distract you. Point out to the defenders of the status quo that historically we always encounter that concern when society expands our moral community. But white men didn't lose the right to vote when women's suffrage was achieved, and they didn't lose any rights when slaves were emancipated or segregation ended. So, probably what you're all waiting to hear. What can you do right now? If you are in Wyoming or know anyone in Wyoming, follow these organizations on social media, sign up for their newsletters, and share with your friends. Stay tuned as they update you on actions to take in the coming months. There will be several opportunities to testify at meetings, even as early as next week. We're organizing to sustain momentum until the next legislative session is beginning in 2025. That work starts now. If you are outside of Wyoming and interested in getting involved in your state or helping on a national level, as well as regional efforts, go to our website, wildlifeforall.us. The QR code will also send you there. There you can sign up for our newsletters and use our Find Your State feature to learn about the specifics of your state wildlife agency, commission, and its funding. This will get you started in understanding opportunities for change in your state. If you represent an organization or a business or are an individual activist that would like to join our coalition, please email me with Wolf Action, big in big all caps in the subject line, and let me know what state you're in. Our coalition members from across the country meet and communicate regularly to exchange knowledge and inform each other's campaigns. We'll be linking folks up within their respective states to plan campaigns. The details of those campaigns are going to depend on the local context, but they may involve in-person activities like film screenings, art exhibits, some fun creative guerrilla marketing, tabling at events, and other summer organizing to spread the word. There will also be options for digital advocacy with social media, writing opinion pieces, letters to the editor of your local paper, and testimony. Importantly, if you are or know a college student that would be interested in getting involved, we want to organize university chapters to activate and support motivated young people in the cause. We've got several research and other internship projects also available immediately and throughout the year. We are finalizing also an advocacy toolkit that will guide activists in how to begin reform efforts in their state and protect wolves. If you would like a copy, please email me with toolkit in the subject line. So I realize I'm leaving you with likely a lot of questions, with a desire to hear more about the specifics, but this is where the work lies ahead. We must work together to think creatively on the most strategic avenues to agitate for durable change. We need to plan now and be persistent in taking action and maintaining the drumbeat of awareness through this next year and beyond. We also need you to take care of yourselves and each other and maintain motivation. So in that spirit, I'd like to leave you with what I hope is an inspirational reminder that the arc of the moral universe is long, but indeed bends towards justice. It is a perfect letter from the author E.B. White to someone who had reached out to him saying that they had lost faith in humanity. I'm just going to read that letter to you now because I think it's a good way to end with this challenging topic. He writes, Mr. Nadeau, as long as there is one upright man, as long as there is one compassionate woman, the contagion may spread and the scene is not desolate. Hope is the thing that is left to us in a bad time. I shall get up on Sunday morning and wind the clock as a contribution to order and steadfastness. Sailors have an expression about the weather. They say the weather is a great bluffer. I guess the same is true of our human society. Things can look dark. Then a break shows in the clouds, and all is changed, sometimes rather suddenly. It is quite obvious that the human race has made a queer mess of life on this planet. But as a people, we probably harbor seeds of goodness that have lain for a long time, waiting to sprout when the conditions are right. Man's curiosity, his relentlessness, his inventiveness, his ingenuity have led him into deep trouble. We can only hope that these same traits will enable him to claw his way out. So hang on to your hat, hang on to your hope, and wind the clock, for tomorrow is another day. Sincerely, E.B. White. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your rapt attention, and we can open it up, I think, to Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle. For anyone who might have joined a little bit late, we are so happy that we are here with Dr. Michelle Lute from Wildlife for All. You can find out more information about Wildlife for All either via the QR code that Michelle just shared or in the chat. We did post a link to their website. But as a reminder, if you have questions, please type them into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Joey Hinton, the Wolf Conservation Center Senior Research Scientist, will begin going through those questions. So if you have a question you would like to be answered, you must type it into the Q&A. So Joey, I'll toss things over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Regan. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Joey Hinton, so I'm here handling questions from Michelle. So yeah, we've got some good ones. I guess the first one I'll start off with, you kind of like tailed off one of your slides at the tail end was on the public trust doctrine. So one of the first questions we got was asking about the applicability of that to protect the wildlife. I would add both sides use that as an argument for their stance. I mean, you talk to wildlife management agencies who would, invoke wolf hunting laws or whatever, they would say they were following through on the public trust doctrine too. And you have advocates like us arguing on the side of it. So I'd be curious if you can clarify that for the audience and
Yeah, Yeah, thank you for that. It's a complex answer because in part it varies state by state. So each state has kind of codified these laws to more or less extent. So in some states, it's very clear that right now existing law is only applying public trust doctrine to water. So there's really clear connections that water is a public good that everybody benefits from. In terms of its application to wildlife, that varies quite a bit, and there are a few lawyers that are testing the waters, so to speak, by seeing which states does wildlife apply to public trust doctrine currently in laws, and which states need to expand or clarify those laws and regulations as wildlife relates to public trust. So it's a growing area of legal analysis and testing from state to state. But in terms of philosophy, everybody agrees on both sides of the aisle, as Dr. Hinton alluded to, that wildlife is a benefit to all people, and so the public trust should apply. So the thing that I think is the key difference between, say, the status quo defenders that are saying, yes, it applies, is how they define the beneficiaries of the trust. And because it benefits them, they're arguing that they're the main beneficiaries of the trust because they use wildlife, and that somebody in a city isn't benefiting from the presence of wildlife. And I think that's pretty obvious. That's not true. We see the way pollinators pollinate all of our crops. Everybody eats those crops. Everybody benefits from clean air and water, and wildlife contribute to those natural cycles. So this notion that it's really only rural folks or really only people who are using wildlife that benefit is just a falsehood, essentially. So I think that expanded understanding of what the beneficiary is the key there. And the other part that's unique that we're arguing, Wildlife for All, is that the beneficiary includes wild animals themselves because they benefit from their own existence and the existence of other species within their systems. And that's often ignored or overlooked.
All right, awesome. Yeah, we're getting a bunch of more questions coming in. So I'm just reading those. I've got a question about animal welfare laws and how to include them with wildlife to ensure that wildlife are covered by, sort of anti-cruelty legislative acts for animals.
Yeah, that's another good area. And this is an area that's a current research need that we're really trying to understand. It's a little bit surprising that maybe people have asked this question before, but these answers are not readily available. And that's what we're looking into. So just in the state of Wyoming, some government officials are disagreeing about whether or not the animal welfare laws apply to wildlife or not. We see a lot of exceptions and regulations for predators and hunting. So there's a lack of clarity on quite how far those loopholes really go. But some people are arguing that predators are indeed animals protected under some of these welfare laws in certain states and then also at the federal level. But it's just confusing, and it might take lawsuits and judges' opinions to really clarify. But we're waiting for more legal analysis and working with lawyers to kind of clarify this on our end and decide what is the appropriate amendments to say that PACT Act of 2019 or whether it would apply currently.
All right, so I'm going to try to tie a handful of questions I've got together here regarding, I guess, viewing industry or recreation and their ability to influence legislators. Why isn't there more influence on that end? Obviously, we're getting questions about eating meat and the livestock industry, the effectiveness of boycotting. I can ask those questions like each one, or I don't know if you just want to if you have a general answer for all that. I'm assuming that's all sort of tied together, basically.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'll jump in, and then if there's a key element if I haven't touched on yet, just feel free to remind me. So, wildlife tourism, why isn't it as influential of an influence, is a great question, because if you're just thinking purely in dollars and cents and capitalistic terms, that is a sustainable industry in terms of bringing money over the course of a year, over and over and over. We know that that's going to support rural Western economies in the long term. Now, there's important considerations about sustainability. It's not that wildlife tourism and watching doesn't have impacts, some negative impacts. So we do have to think carefully about that. But in terms of the economic argument, it is going to bring in sustained funding for these states and very local rural economies in perpetuity. Things like extractive industries, like mining, like agriculture, with the onset of drought and climate change, are already waning and are going to continue to be waning. And they are not the answer for rural Western economies in the long run, or even today. But they still, because of political inertia, because of cowboy culture, because of this unreally criticized default to American traditions, they still have this outsized influence. Ranchers and a certain kind of hunting lobby have this outside influence in places like Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And that's culture, and that's what needs to change. And so that's really important. And there are pro-wildlife businesses, especially around Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park, that make money from wildlife alive. And so they are seeing that they need to compete and really show their contributions to the state. So they're organizing into pro-wildlife business coalitions, and they exist in Wyoming and Montana. I don't know if there are any in Idaho. I'm trying to find out. I haven't met any of those folks, but they might be out there. But there are definitely folks organizing and doing this work in Montana and Idaho, in Wyoming, excuse me. In terms of boycotts, really need to be sustained, and that's super hard to do. We are seeing a great response right now from people calling in, so there is some promise to show some economic impact. So I think it's worth considering. I think there's also a parallel strategy of pushing people to those pro-wildlife businesses to show that we want to support wildlife alive. We want to support local economies and businesses, but we're only going to do it when they meet our values and are not exploiting wildlife the way some other businesses or tourism is in Wyoming in particular. So that's my initial response. Do you feel like I covered?
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, I mean, that's what I was getting, like, why does livestock industry have so much more influence than, like, I guess the rising, wildlife viewing industry does, and of course the boycott. So yeah, good to go. Regan, if you got anything to chime in, feel free. But I've got a question here regarding intersectionality. You got some good comments on that because of what you covered earlier in the conversation. But I'm being asked about, like, indigenous perspectives and why aren't they being heard more? How are they being incorporated into this conversation?
Such a good question. It's such a frustrating part of this work, and it's such a key part of Wildlife for All's push for democratic governance, is that all voices need to be heard. And it's a special case with tribes and First Nations because they're sovereign nations. And what's been happening in wildlife management is they're treated like another stakeholder group. Like, we've got hound hunters, we've got bear hunters, we've got all these different folks, we've got trappers, we've got wildlife advocates as one group, and you get one representative. And then the tribes also get one representative, as if they're just another stakeholder, instead of country to country, sovereign nation to sovereign nation consultation. And gray wolves are the perfect, sad, tragic example of how often tribal consultation is a box that gets checked that is so unjust and inadequate. Look no further than every decision to delist wolves. They are not considered, the tribe's opinions are not often considered. Wisconsin has one of the most egregious examples. The Wisconsin Commission was deciding on a wolf hunt, and because they have treaty obligations to give basically the tribes almost a 50% quota of any wolves that they hunt and other natural resources and wildlife. The commission has worked around that, and basically in one meeting when they're deciding a hunt, it was this like negotiation style, like, okay, we really want to kill as many wolves as we can, and we know the tribes don't. So let's just weigh up the quota for wolves past what our state agency biologists are saying, because we know the tribes aren't going to kill them because they've got this like spiritual connection and they consider them brothers, right? But we don't really want that to influence the maximum amount of wolves that we want to kill. So let's up the number because we know the tribes won't kill them. And that happened in a public comment, and the DNR secretary turns to the camera. It's it's being on Zoom and it's on YouTube, and the DNR secretary is like, public, pay attention. This is happening. This is horrible. I mean, it was the most egregious example of how, and again, it was older white men that were all saying we want to kill as many wolves as possible, and we're going to ignore the tribal, spiritual, important connection to seeing wolves as family members. And 100 years, thousands of years of sacred relationships be damned. So that speaks to the problem that we're up against, and why, as we're creating space as wildlife advocates, we also have to bring other people along to create space at the decision-making table for their voices. And it's complicated because each tribe, or even individuals within the tribe, have different values for wildlife, are not always going to agree with us. And that's democracy, and that's messy, but we've got to bring people along because it really is about justice for all.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Do have, I think, a governance question. I'm going to read it because it's a paragraph. So it's from Dave, and it's here it is. It's because of America's federalist system, people who live outside of these states have limited or even negative impact on pressure and changes in wildlife policy, as communities close ranks against outside pressure and state officials are somewhat insulated from national pressures. How should the discourse adapt to mitigate local pushback and change the culture?
That is a big question.
You got it? I don't need to read it. Okay.
I was reading along. Yeah. No,
you can see it. Awesome.
Yeah, no, I gotta like hear it and see it. Yeah, no, that is a great question. I don't know that I have the best answer, because that's kind of what we're trying to work on. That's part of our theory of change. And I think it goes back to public trust principles in defining the beneficiaries, in realizing that political boundaries do not necessarily correspond with beneficiaries, and how natural cycles work, with the way wild animals migrate, with the way humans move around. So people travel into Wyoming to see wild wolves, even though they don't live there, but they benefit from knowing that those animals exist. They benefit from being near or around wild ecosystems. So I think really thinking hard about how we define beneficiaries and how we distribute the costs for protecting those spaces across all the beneficiaries. So if everybody benefits, everybody should also pay. And that's why I think general funding is really important, so that we get away from this notion that it's a user pays model. And so only hunters, fishers, and trappers who pay these license fees are the ones that get to benefit because they're the ones paying for it. Well, everybody benefits and everybody can pay for it. And those initiatives have been proposed in lots of places. But again, the status quo defenders don't want to share. And so they want to perpetuate this narrative that they're the only ones paying. But it's not even true anymore, because federal excise taxes through Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson, that funds a lot of state agency work, is not just, it's the majority of those funds are coming from the non-hunting, non-consumptive use user groups. So guns and ammunition, most people who are buying that for target shooting and practice and shooting sports that aren't related to wildlife are home defense. And so that's the vast majority of Pittman-Robertson dollars now. It's something like 73% is now coming from non-consumptive users. But the consumptive users don't want you to know that, so they keep saying, no, we're everything from Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson is coming from us, and those are the excise taxes funding the state wildlife agencies. And that's just not true. It hasn't been true for a long time, many years.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too is the stuff doesn't fund the Fish and Wildlife Service. It doesn't fund the National Park Service. It doesn't fund protection of endangered species on Department of Defense lands. So if you have a Western state that's predominantly federally owned, Pittman-Robertson funds aren't paying for, you know, anything on that stuff. It's all covered through general taxes across the US. And so if you actually, yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, the other thing too, I think the question was alluding to maybe like the Senate, where you mentioned Tester was able to, kill take them off the gray wolves off the protection. And so there's a situation where you have a senator in a state that has like, I don't know what Montana has, probably like 500,000 people or something. They get two senators versus like California, where you have like millions and millions of people, and they get two senators. And so the federal system can, like, if we just had the House, I think you'd probably see better laws that are more equitable and I guess democratic, but the Senate is kind of anti-democratic and kind of override those things. So I think a little bit of mentioning, I think that's worth, anyway, I'm rambling.
Sure. Yeah, no, excellent point.
Yeah. Because anyway, Regan, I think wanted to jump on about the Colorado.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. We have a really good question from someone who lives in Colorado, and they're acknowledging the recent reintroduction of wolves, but they're concerned about states like Colorado, and we could also apply it to Washington and Oregon, where states might eventually fall into the same patterns as the Rocky Mountains. And so what are some preventative actions people can start taking now to hopefully create a more equitable environment for wildlife?
Such a great question. And I hope I don't sound like a broken record, but that's why we need to be doing this governance reform work in every state. Because again, if they lose protections in the future, we're just watching this sad, tragic movie over and over again. And there's nothing to say that it won't happen in Colorado or Washington or Oregon. And it is in some cases happening. Now, Colorado and Washington are actually pretty good examples where the commission has diversified representation a little bit better, and we are seeing better policy there. So there is some hope, but there's still much more work to be done to continue diversifying representation, to make sure that governors are appointing good commissioners. And every one of those states could really use improvements in their wolf management plans because they're still catering to the hunting and ranching lobby that want to kill any wolves that might look twice at livestock. And so thinking about getting livestock off of public lands where the priority should be wildlife conservation is a huge thing. And I think now that I'm remembering a previous question about maybe there's some questions or allusions to eating beef or the agricultural industry. Yes, absolutely. Not eating beef is a huge help, not only to wildlife conservation, but also to climate change. So cows contribute a lot to climate change. They also degrade environments and wetlands, and they're just inefficient sources of protein. And they're the excuse, cows and sheep are the excuse for so much lethal predator management everywhere in the country, but especially in the American West, even though it doesn't work. And the most effective methods are to preventing conflict before it happens with ancient tools like livestock guardian dogs and fences, and with modern updates, like we call them range riders now, not shepherds. There's all kinds of ways to prevent conflict, and lethal management doesn't do that. It doesn't help, and it might even contribute to conflict. So public lands ranching needs to end. Protection and prioritization of wildlife conservation, particularly on public lands, needs to be happening a lot more. And then we've got to do governance reform work so that everyone's voice is heard and science is considered, and the vast majority of the American public is with us. So if everybody's being listened to and our policies reflect our values and science, then we're going to get good wildlife policy, and we're going to protect wolves on the ground state by state. And that's a lot of work. And that is relationship building with your commissioners, but it's got to start now. It's got to start yesterday, but let's get it done.
Awesome. I don't know how much more time you want. We got lots of questions. If
I
you're
can stay on.
okay, I'm good with that too. One question I like, and it might be interesting. I don't mind addressing it too. Basically, what's going on with our wildlife management majors at the universities, and how are they being trained? What are they being taught? I don't know if you came out of the same field as I did. So
Yeah, absolutely. And there was research. So I did my PhD at a land grant university, Michigan State University, and there was a robust fish and wildlife department. And some of the professors actually did studies looking at why are we losing our students through the program? And then also why are our students not getting jobs in state and federal agencies doing wildlife conservation? And one of the things they found is that students don't want these jobs once they realize the culture of these agencies are captured by hook and bullet, and that those values aren't reflected, their values aren't reflected in those agency cultures. And so they go off into other jobs because they're like, I don't want to just propagate more hunting and fishing. I'm interested in actual wildlife conservation, and those jobs are so few. And so that's another area for reform and for change, is to empower those young people to get in those jobs and feel safe to be able to contribute to an agency culture shift. Because if we don't help those people stay in those jobs, then we've got inertia in the agency culture for a long time. So that's my initial thoughts in response to that question. You, Joey, do you have?
Yeah, my experience coming through the hook and bullet programs is that they do have, like, they actively like push the ideology of like that North American model onto the students when they come in. So it's not like a passive thing. I think, in my view, that they do recognize this sort of change in demographics, and they realize at some point, like, you know, you're going to see more kids coming in to the undergrad programs that are more urban, I guess, and less likely to have that traditional hook and bullet background, or, you know, being raised as hunters and fishermen. And so, yeah, I think it's the whole point of that, pushing that narrative for the past 20 years, is to basically to codify a particular, you know, ideology that, you know, hunters and this sort of type of management should be prioritized over other things. And so, yeah, I think that's part of the problem with the field, and the over reliance on the Pittman Robertson funding, because that gets takes up all the oxygen in the room. You really can't talk about how federal agencies are really funded through Congress versus how state agencies are funded through, you know, more of a household budget where they rely on funding from the federal government. You know, Fish and Wildlife Service, I think if they need increased funding, they just request it from Congress, and then Congress can just increase their budget, you know, kind of like DOD does. But with state agencies, that's not the case. That's why they're so heavily relying on the PR funding, is because they're like a household. They have to bring in, like, South Carolina can't just write South Carolina dollars. They have to rely on federal dollars. So they have to have another funding mechanism for people. It's something that we don't teach. But yeah, it's cultural. I've seen it, you know, a lot of times you see our traditional ecology departments at odds with our management departments too. People don't realize that. And so you get more entrenched, and that's what I had written down here, was the whole traditionalist versus mutualist viewpoints, because that comes up, I think, in our training, in our education. I think the younger generation is more, I guess, primed for advocacy. They've grown up with climate change, loss of biodiversity. So they don't hold back on their opinions on those things. They're not being biased or just, you know, raising issues because they can, but it's a real problem that needs to be resolved. And it's a problem that they're going to have to resolve once they assume leadership of these institutions. And so I think there's odds there that the older generation just doesn't appreciate. And so I know I'm rambling a bit, but I thought that was a good question. I think it's probably spend the next 30 minutes on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, you bring up a really good point about, you know, it's so hard to compete in these news cycles. And I don't know that people are really appreciating, you know, the fact that these young people feel like it's worth it to get arrested and to have a record, because they're so terrified of their future. You know, I think people want to dismiss, like, oh, these kids just want to get attention and they're gluing themselves to Monet paintings and throwing tomato soup around. But it's like, no, they're actually really terrified. And that tells you something about the world that we've created and what we owe them to help them. And I think that point can't be emphasized enough.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. I'm just trying to read. If there's any questions that popped out to you that you saw, Michelle, that you want to take care of. I'm just looking through them at the moment. There's some folks they're sending some updates regarding some activities and stuff like that. We can pass that information on to you at the end, regarding like announcements or something like that. Regan, do we need to make those announcements? Are you seeing the
No,
ones?
that's fine. No, yeah, that's fine. I actually want to jump in with a question about buffer zones, and the efficacy of those, you know, with we've seen Denali in the past with attempts for expanding buffers. Do you think that the town, this question is specifically related to Daniel, Wyoming, but for areas that are close to national parks but don't currently have buffer zones, do you think there's any benefit or potential in appealing to state and federal agencies to add policies to create these zones?
Yeah, I definitely think it's worth considering. I can think of international contexts where buffer zones are super helpful. Usually, though, the contexts where I'm thinking they really work, like around Chitwan National Park in Nepal, it's a lot more protective for wildlife in those buffer zones, but there's access for local communities to do some resource extraction. But say tigers are still protected in those places. You know, we see this trophy game management area around one section of Washington after you leave the northwest corner and the national parks. But animals are still able to be hunted. So that buffer zone would have to really have really strong protections for wildlife, because these, you know, grizzly bears and bison and wolves that step across the park can be hunted, and we're seeing them hunted at really high rates. And perhaps, well, we know they're being purposely baited. The same with wolves that are introduced into Colorado. As soon as they step over the line into southern Wyoming, they're being baited and killed. So these buffer zones would really have to have pretty strong regulations, I think, to do any good. But I think it's worth considering for sure. I think it would be helpful.
Amazing. And we do just have so many questions coming in. I think, honestly, we could probably be here for hours. But I do want to remind everyone, Michelle very generously put her email on the screen. And so if folks do want to explore the conversation further, we had several questions about how to join the listserv and how to join the coalition. So Michelle and the Wildlife for All team can certainly address those. Perhaps this is also an indication that we should expand on these conversations with future webinars and more kind of narrow discussions to really strategize. But as a reminder to folks, this webinar will also be posted on the Wolf Center's YouTube channel within the next few days. So if you would like to rewind or share, we also had questions about perhaps being able to use some of your talking points, Michelle, in their own advocacy as they try to, you know, connect with their own communities. And so you'll have that YouTube page there. But again, apologies to everyone who asked amazing questions that we weren't able to get to. But the Wildlife for All website is very robust and very thorough. So there's a very good chance if you visit the Wildlife for All website, which is again posted in the chat, you can answer a lot of your questions through that website or by following their social media channels as well. Michelle, before we wrap up, is there anything you wanted to say to the audience?
Just thank you so much. I really enjoyed these questions, and yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions you have. Please feel free to use the talking points. I can share the actual text from the script if that's helpful. I can share citations, anything. I'm just happy to help support this collective work across the country. So thank you all.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you everyone so much for joining. Thank you again to Dr. Michelle Lute from Wildlife for All for very generously offering her time tonight. And huge thanks, of course, to the WCC's Dr. Joey Hinton for moderating and kind of weeding through all of those amazing questions. But we will try to get something else on the book soon to perhaps expand on this series. As a reminder, the Wolf Center is also hosting Dr. Ron Sutherland of Wildlands Network next Wednesday for a Red Wolf webinar. So if folks want to pivot species just a little, many of the challenges that Michelle talked about tonight are applicable to red wolf recovery and can certainly be explored next week as well. So registration for that can be found on our website. But thank you all so much for joining. We hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to working with everyone soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.